Welcome back, students, for today's lecture. It is Thursday, April 9th. This will be our last lecture of the week, so we can get a nice head start on the weekend. Um, we'll have a Zoom meeting today at 2 o'clock, so if you can make it, that's great. It'll be similar to last week, or to, I guess, Mondays, just catching up, making sure everything's going all right. um, that kind of stuff. So, yesterday we talked about the Voting Rights Act or Civil Rights Act 1964, and then we went through the ways Southerners were disenfranchised from the right to vote. Now, today we're going to talk about the events that inspired one of my all-time favorite movies. This is a true story. It happens in Mississippi in 1964. And the events surround three civil rights workers that were from Washington, D.C., or they were sent from Washington, D.C., and they were to participate and help lead some of the civil rights movements. A lot of the movements were led by Northern African Americans or Northern whites. It wasn't until later on that Southern African Americans were able to lead movements, and it's not because the Southern African Americans didn't want to. They didn't really know how, and they were worried about it originally. They were nervous about it because they saw firsthand the struggle that it was, and the tension that it caused. Some of the Northerners didn't have quite as much conflict, so they were free to do more of being activists. So it was common for Northerners to come down and help lead movements. Now, these three men, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, they come down from Washington, D.C., and they swing through a bunch of places in the South. And they get to Mississippi. They get to a town called Philadelphia, Mississippi. Not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, not Big Philly, but a smaller town in Mississippi called Philadelphia. And these three are a part of groups that are known to Southern white people as for causing trouble. That in their eyes, that's what they were doing. Now, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner were white civil rights activists from the North. James Chaney is originally from the South. He's an African American from the South, but he had become fed up with. He's from Mississippi. I think he's from Philadelphia. That's why he went on this specific trip. He had become fed up with, the abuse of his rights. So he participates in some of the movements, and now he wants to help lead one. They originally went down to Philadelphia, Mississippi to investigate and help after a church bombing. So they go down June 21st of 64. They are in jail, or they are in Philadelphia, and they are arrested for speeding, and they are held what is known as incommunicado. I don't really know how exactly you pronounce that, but incommunicado means they are not allowed to they're not allowed to communicate with anybody outside of jail. Like, it's a basic right. When you get to prison, you are allowed one phone call, and they were not allowed that. So no one knew they were arrested. No one knew where they were. This is obviously the days before for social media and worldwide connectivity. Like they couldn't just pull out their phones and record being arrested or post on Snapchat like happens all the time now. Um, they were held there for a couple hours for speeding and not even resisting. They pulled over, and the police officer knew who they were. He knew beforehand who he was pulling over. They were followed basically, but they're let go a couple hours later. Now, the events of all this are going to seem kind of strange, but it'll all add up here in a moment. So, the sheriff's deputy, Cecil Price of Philadelphia, Mississippi, was a Ku Klux Klan member. While these three men are sitting in prison, he lets his local Klan chapter know what's going on, and he sets up a plan. So wheels are turning, and after a couple hours, they drive the boys back to their car, which was just on the edge of town, and they are released, and they are told to get the heck out of Philadelphia, Mississippi. Get out of the South. So the boys get in their car, and I don't know if the boys were going to get out of the South and end their trip. Probably not. But they get in their car, and they're on their way out of town. And then he follows their car. And he pulls them over again, a couple miles away from where he let them off. Now, by this time, Klansmen were able to get in position. That's probably why they were held in prison for a couple hours, was to allow the Klan to get set up. So they pull over again. And Schwerner and Goodman are sitting in the front seat. Cheney's in the back. And the Klansmen all surround the car. And this is off on a country road. This is not like a highway. Like, this is pulled off to the side where it's not going to get much traffic and there's really not going to be anything known. They shoot Goodman and Schwerner in the chest and kill them. And then Cheney is shot in the head 3 times, whipped with a bike chain, and castrated. And the order of those 3 things is unknown. My bet would be he was shot and killed last. I'm sure he was probably tortured before his killing. And their bodies are buried just in the middle of nowhere, try to cover their trace. Their car is pushed into a river, like deep into a river. And these 3 boys go missing, and media runs with it. It gets a lot of media attention. Now, this was a big deal, but this was far from the first time something like this had happened. Civil rights workers from the North had gone missing and were killed in the South pretty often. So what made this so publicized? Probably the biggest reason was that there were 2 white boys killed. If they were all African American, or if they just killed Cheney, it probably doesn't get more than a half a paragraph mention in the local newspaper. And there probably isn't much of an investigation. Probably. That's not for certain, but, you know, history does tell us stuff, and history has said that that is probably what would have happened. But regardless, there's an investigation that follows. The state refuses to pursue anything. They give a very minor investigation, ask some questions, nothing becomes obvious, and they go, all right, well, that's too bad, and they leave it. But President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who is more commonly known as LBJ, LBJ is very in tune with the civil rights movement. He was an interesting president. He was JFK's vice president. He takes over for him, but LBJ is very interesting. He's somewhat of a Southerner himself. He's from Texas, and Texas doesn't really count as far as like the deep South. Texas had its segregation issues, but it wasn't near anything like Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, those places. But Johnson takes this seriously, and since the state won't pursue anything, Johnson decides to force a federal investigation. So he puts the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, in charge of this investigation. J. Edgar Hoover is one of the most famous I don't even know what he qualifies as, one of the most famous Americans in our history. For some of the things he did as head of the FBI. Some good, some not very good. But he leads this investigation, and it takes 44 days, over 6 weeks, before they find the bodies. They sent thousands of officers, of soldiers, of really any branch of public office they could find. They sent them down to investigate, and they finally find the boys buried. And then they find the vehicle, or first of all, sorry, they find the vehicle. They pull it out of the lake. And then they find the bodies. So now we have a case. Because Deputy Price had said, oh, they probably just ran off. They're probably in Canada. So there's no proof they were even killed until now. Now it's a murder. Now it's serious. So as I said, this catches national attention. It hits people right in the heart. And from there, the FBI gathers a lot of information. They question Deputy Price. They question local Klansmen. And they come to the conclusion of the Klan is definitely responsible for the death of these boys. And the officers were at best negligent, at worst complicit, meaning they helped with the murder. But the problem here is there is no admissions of guilt, there is no ratting out of anybody, and most of all, there's no proof of a murder weapon. In murder trials, the most important thing that the prosecutors can have is the murder weapon. In this case, there was none. Like they as far as evidence, like they didn't have the gun. Whoever shot them still had the gun, and there was, unless they left it somewhere or it was found on them, they weren't going to be caught. So None of these men could be charged with murder because out of all of them, 5 shots are fired, 1 each into the White Boys, 3 into James Chaney. There is no way to prove who shot who unless somebody snitches. Somebody rats someone else out, and that didn't happen. So they could not pin the deaths on one individual. You can't pin a murder trial on a group of people and just punish them all for the acts of 1 or 2 people. Now I know that well, first of all, so they are charged with violating victims' rights. That is the only charge that that Hoover and the federal prosecutors could bring up on them, with no proof of who pulled the trigger, but they could prove that the boys were falsely arrested and falsely imprisoned and held without a phone call. They could prove that, which in their eyes was better than nothing. So I think about 10 or 11 of them are found guilty, but their prison sentences are suspended, meaning they're not forced to serve. So they basically get away with it. Now, I think in the 1990s, new evidence comes out, and the guy that actually did pull the trigger is tried for manslaughter. Again, he can't be charged with murder. 30 years later, he still can't be charged with murder because they never found he pled not guilty and they never found the murder weapon. But he's charged with manslaughter and he's found guilty, and he ended up serving the rest of his life in prison. I think he died recently. And it's kind of a sad story. There's just you don't get the sense of justice that you like to see when something as horrible as this happens. And you see all the time people getting off on light charges or getting off on a technicality when committing a crime that we think is egregious. But you you have to understand how our justice system works. And what I'm about to say, this isn't, you need to know this, but this isn't for the test. This isn't for this chapter. This isn't even for this class. This is so you, as a citizen of the United States, understand how our judicial system works, how our justice system works. Our founding fathers founded the laws and the enforcement of laws in order to keep innocent people out of prison, not to lock up bad guys. That is the focal point of our justice system, is to defend the innocent. And more often than not, that's the correct way. That's the moral way. And sometimes that's not satisfactory, and sometimes that doesn't create the outcome that you want. But think of the flip side. If the justice system is created purely to lock up bad people, then you have what is known as a police state. And you are in danger of being prosecuted for crimes you never committed. And you are in danger of being found guilty of crimes you didn't commit. Now, does that happen in our court system? Sure. Yeah, it does. But with way less occurrences than it would in a police state. Sometimes our judicial system doesn't seem fair, but I promise you it is way more fair and morally built than the opposite way. And that's just a lesson that I want you guys to know as citizens. It'll serve you well. Because the saying innocent till proven guilty, it's not just a cliche. That is the basis of how our judicial system is founded. Guilty till proven innocent is way more flawed. And that is usually the justice system of a totalitarian regime, of a dictatorship. And if we don't want to fall under those lines, then we must protect our rights to freedom and our rights to innocence. So, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to get on my soapbox there, but I think that's really important that you guys know that. So, a movie is made about this murder in Mississippi. I don't remember the years, it's either late 80s or early to mid 90s. And it's called Mississippi Burning. It wasn't it wasn't a blockbuster movie, like it wasn't a big record breaker. It had some pretty famous actors in it at the time, none of which you guys probably know, like Gene Hackman. He was the original Lex Luthor. Uh, but I think that's what he was. Or the head coach in Hoosiers. But it's the movie's about these murders, but it's from the perspective of two FBI agents from DC. One's a northerner and one's a native southerner. And it's about their chase for this case. It's a great movie. I love it. It's one of my favorites. I recommend if anybody ever. It's not on any of the stream apps. Like it's not on Netflix or Prime or Hulu. I've tried finding it. But if you guys ever come across it, I highly recommend watching it. It's a great movie. So that is Murder in Mississippi. The essential question: why were the suspects charged with violating civil rights and not charged with murder? Hey, I talked pretty extensively about that. You don't have to get real long and give me a 5-paragraph answer about our justice system. Although if you want to, that'd be great. Just what are the basics? Why weren't they charged with murder? It seems pretty obvious that they should have been. Why weren't they? So that is the lecture for today. We will get a nice hefty 4 days off. There will be no Zoom meeting on Monday. Since Monday after Easter, not having any lecture or any notes, no Zoom meeting that day either. We'll just skip it, and then we'll plan on the scheduled one next Thursday. We'll still have one today, 2 o'clock. But I appreciate you guys stopping in and listening. Be safe. Have a great weekend and a happy Easter.